Hello, this is From Caracas and I am Ray Gomez. Today we are summing up the artistic work of Juan Calzadilla, an outstanding representative of fine arts and literature in Venezuela. Please join us for the next few minutes.
How do you do, Master?
Fine. Thank you.
Gracias a usted por estar con nosotros. Bueno, aquí he estado leyendo títulos como
Thank you for being with us. Well, I've been reading titles like Out of Limits, Images and Words, Jewels of Roof, and the reproduction of the sample forms escaping from the canvas,
en la edición número 57 de la Bienal de Venecia,
which was presented in the 57th edition of the Venice Biennial in 2017. And they mention all these titles because they are also part of an exhibition that for those who are in Venezuela during this time, you can see in the National Art Gallery. What does this exhibition represent to you?
Well, I'm going to tell you that we are in the spaces that for Venezuelan citizens constitute a masterpiece of architecture, which is the National Art Gallery.
The GAN, as they commonly say.
The GAN, which is a great museum, a museum of 5,000 square meters, only for exhibitions on 2 levels, so that permanently here we have samples of national artists, because that is the
objective.
The coverage.
And that you have also been closely linked to the history of the National Art Gallery. Let's leave that for the next minute. Let's now talk about the exhibition.
Well, this is an exhibition that in its central core collects the works that have taken to the Biennial of Venice as a representation of Venezuela in 2017. Then it is brought here in the terms in which was made there, that is to say, in installation.
An installation
with certain features that have nothing to do with traditional painting, because it was exhibited here is a replica of the graphic work based on drawings of mine and carried to prints that were printed on an aluminum surface in the form of bands. That symbolically represents that the painting is escaping and goes in that process of escaping from the traditional framework, looking for other spaces, and the representation derived of that symbology is given by bands that rise and fall, go back, give the impressions that they escape, but they continue in their prison, which is the museum. Then it's a work derived from drawing, not painting.
So it is a combination of techniques.
Of course, techniques, especially in embossing, because the technological impression of reproduction for the reproduction of works of art has come to a great perfection. Today, you can reproduce from the smallest thing of a millimeter to very large dimensions with the same intensity of the tones that the original has, that have never been seen. Then,
there is thanks to the technology.
Exactly, and art is becoming extremely technological. There are very few people who do things in the tradition of the Renaissance, where everything was manual, handmade. Every day the spaces become more occupied by the electromechanical.
But is there no risk that at some point in the technology what prevails, or regardless of technological advances, the artistic creation always emerges?
Well, the creation is given by what we can attribute to these technological elements when they are combined, but not through the crafts, as was always the painting, but through ideas. So, it is said that art becomes more and more conceptual. You go to a biennial today and do not find a sculpture, an old painting, no. pure photographic machines, video beam, right? That's the way it goes nowadays. And there is a struggle because people massively, as you can see in the biennials, go looking for those things that can be identified and that can make the manual work. A work solved with elements of the plastic arts of the whole tradition. This is a mixture of those things, because those drawings are not mechanical. They aren't made automatically through a machinery, but resolved by what we might call a partnership with scripture. I'm not really a plastic artist, but rather a writer.
I will take the opportunity to ask a question that will go back to the origins. Who is Juan Calzadilla and how does he excel in the Venezuelan art?
Well, I come from a generation that was formed in the 60s, in the heat of the political struggles that were waged at the time. The changes that were happening in the world, for example, the Cuban Revolution, the social democrat governments that in this country sought to align with the neoliberal or capitalist positions. Then, at that time, was formed a generation known as the whale's roof that was here in Venezuela, mixing something unusual at the time, that was the politics, manifests and pamphlets with the works of art and the literature in pure terms, even in an international language, accepting the influence.
What contributions did the Whale's Roof give, not only to the history of the arts in Venezuela, but also to the history of universal arts?
Well, the whale's roofs is studied a lot, even through all South America, right? Because of these very special features, we had to accept the form of commitment as a way of doing works of art as well. In the case of us, most and all painting and poetry.
There is to say, there was a conjugation of political and artistic militancy.
Of course, because, of course, we were at that time of a global change that implied the internalization of language, especially in poetry and already in painting, because Venezuela has a tradition of very old abstract art. Since the decades of the 40s, abstract painting is done here and also considered an innovation. Of abstract art, various currents were developed, and within these currents, there was a disaffected movement with a programmatic line that ordered to do completely programmed geometric works at the service of architecture. The whale's roof broke with that and featured a version of what was known in those moments as informalism, which was an absolutely free painting.
We could say that it was one of the contributions of the Venezuelan art to the isthmus that were already known as avant-garde of the late 19th and early 20th century.
Change of the hegemonic codes that then prevailed, where you had to be abstract geometric or you had to be figurative, and tendencies were alternated. We broke with the painting and we exposed that art had to be implosive, had to be visceral, had to be rebellious against the dogmas that could be at that time.
And the literature, how did you accomplish that?
Literature, we managed to create a more universal language that was out of the trends. Let's say of traditional poetry, rhyme and verse. Then we brought to poetry the free verse, and a very important influence that then spread all over South America, which was surrealism. Of course, we were not so real, but we had a reference, as I had in the drawing, because my drawings come out of writing. I mean, someone who spends a lifetime writing by hand, but is formed by the effect of the imagination, were transformed into figurative forms, organic forms, and return again to the writing.
There is that those images that you achieved through writing, you consider them into graphic images.
Sure, of course.
And vice versa.
Yes, because they were expressive. Let's say it was a new aesthetic that is now in the hands of approximately 20 artists in the world, including some Latin American, Colombian, Cuban, who make scriptural art. I mean, the organic, figurative form, and in my case, most of all surreal, because they are product not of the observation of things, but from the imagination, the subconscious, and well, there is a whole movement, and that was the original proposal when I was sent to Venice, which was that the writing art had, at least at this moment in which it was booming, a representative. But I am not a traditional plastic artist. Rather,
How do you define yourself?
how do I define?
Right, to yourself.
Well, I define myself as an integral and experimental artist, in the sense that I always seek that the things I do appear for the first time, that haven't been done before, neither within my previous work nor in front of what others do. And I promote that people are completely free of all that binds them to routine, and to do things according to the conveniences that only obstruct the imaginative process to come to a liberation. As you know, not only in art, in life and everything, right? Don't you think?
Right, and on that basis, what has been the contribution that Juan Calzadilla has given to the new generation of artists?
Well, I'm seeing as some kind of master, a workshop worker who has worked hard with young writers in workshops, sometimes official, sometimes on my own, showing capacities and outputs to poetry, so that I could, everyone, find themselves and become satisfied with what they do. And I have also been a scholar of painting, of the history of painting. I have about 30 volumes dedicated to important plastic artists in the country, from the 19th century masters to the latest promotions in the educational sense, to show what they did, how they did it, to what degree they associate with the emergent artists, contemporaries, what are their contributions. All that is contained in, let's say, a chronicle, because I do not consider myself a critic of art, but there is a large historical space where you talk about those artists, and that allows to keep the memory of the things done, and they will not be forgotten because of what was written and said about them. So that is also a contribution, and it's a contribution that is closely linked to my work, because in a way the artistic in me combines two sides. On one hand, creativity, unlimited creativity, always looking for new media, going beyond the frameworks, as I said before, and the analytical part, study, artistic movements, artists. I was twice the director of the National Art Gallery.
And returning to the National Art Gallery, what memories come to your mind when you enter these facilities? The National Art Gallery, what does it represent for Juan Calzadilla?
Well, it is the place where practically, as a plastic artist, and as a critic, as an historian, I was, because I entered the National Art Gallery when it was called Museum of Fine Arts in 1959. And from that time, I was always linked to all activities that were made in the field of plastic arts, both at the museum and in the country.
When you were given the mission to lead the National Art Gallery, how did you conceive to lead the museum with these characteristics?
Well, look, the National Art Gallery was founded in 1976 and occupied some spaces, or a part of the spaces of the Museum of Fine Arts. So that was the Museum of Fine Arts occupied by the Universal Art and again of National Art, in parallel to remove it from the Museum of Fine Arts, which is a neoclassical building. This huge temple was created, known as the National Art Gallery, and that happens in 2009. From that year on, we're trying to give a definitive form to this, in which the base of its operation can be found to adapt it to the needs that national artists have. It hasn't been easy, because the space is very large and, of course, requires many resources to put it to work.
You have just mentioned two important elements which have not been easy precisely because of the number of national artists there and deserve to be exhibited in the National Art Gallery. But secondly, that this requires resources. Then I ask you, what has been the link between the Venezuelan state and the museum of these characteristics so that the exhibition does not become only artists of the capital, Caracas, but also a representation of artists from various parts of the country?
Well, there is an interesting that, as in Latin American countries, the artists of the regions that used to be called the province develop and come to the capital.
The migration.
The migration, which, well, is reflected in the fact that become already citizens and enjoy the privileges of the city. So, many artists, but here is the following. Artistic institutions of all kinds are not national. Our publishers are public. They are national. They are not private. So that allows more people to have access to those media than if they were private, because logically it is much more difficult. Then that is important, because having support from the state, you can have everything you want, but within a scheduled framework that involves taking into account the urban and the capital, and the provincial, the regions. So, it is very difficult, and that is currently working is to create a statute of the museums. We have approximately, in Caracas, 8 museums. It's the city with more museums in Latin America, and the GAN is, according to some architects, is the largest museum of Latin America. It's a very big challenge that we can give to this a very specific function in relation to what is happening in the world with the plastic arts, because we have to remain as we have always been in the 20th century. universal, international, recognized in a much broader context than Venezuela, right? In that way we're going. That we don't lose our national identity as Venezuelans, as Caribbeans.
Speaking of national identity, that's right. Speaking of national identity, how is it reflected in the work of Juan Calzadilla, the self-consciousness of being Venezuelan?
Well, I would say language.
Because it is difficult, let us say, at plain sight precisely by the techniques that you employ of more abstract art to say, but it is a Venezuelan artist.
Sure. Well, I think that you know it well. The Caribbean, the Antillean have a very deep capacity, natural and visual sensibility, and that, of course, can be expressed according to training in a certain bias. I mean, I am figurative. I will face the problem of representing regional typologies. What happens in the world and in everyday life. But if I am trained in another space like the academy or international language, I'll make things also in the same way, but in an international language like mine, which is not specifically from anywhere, but where you can recognize the impulse, the natural, the visual, the imagination, always burning.
What elements of the Venezuelan people has Juan Calzadilla taken into account to conceive this work? I mean, elements of the Venezuelan's identity, the common Venezuelan citizen of the street, as he thinks, as he talks, as he walks, as he argues, even to issues of politics, art, culture.
No, for that I have another medium, another language, which is literature, poetry. That's reflected in my poetry. I have a book called Dictated by the Pack, because my poetry is urban, touches the themes of the city, but not the everyday city, habitual, peaceful, quiet, but urban conflicts and the city.
I imagine, for example,
which are
That's
also
right.
political conflicts. So that is what I reflect with a language that sometimes is very close to the surrealist language, and sometimes to a conceptual language where ideas are handled, expressions. But that's not representative, in the sense that I write as do the painters of the school of Caracas. Landscaping. You know that we in Venezuela had the scenic movement, one of the most important in Latin America, known as the School of Caracas, almost equivalent to the quality of the Mexican movement. Well, and I don't work with that perspective because each one has its own aesthetics in relation to its possibilities and
what is your
information.
aesthetic? What is your aesthetics to look at the city and then take it into the artistic plane?
Yes, right. To get first a language, you have to make
Right,
a
your
language
own
of
language.
yourself. A language of your own with the elements that the means give you, the reality, and then the language applying it to consequently to a thought that can manifest in the fiction or in the poetry. It doesn't matter, right? But I have proposed, most of all, in the unity that I have in the plastic arts and the poetic language, is the integration. That at any given moment, the borders disappear and the things are mixed, as if in the background there was only one language, a language that is expressed, right? It is expressed in drawing, in painting, is expressed in the search that remains faithful to the country and to the national identity of which you speak. Yes, that's where we were going.
Master, thank you very much for this interview for Telesur in English.
And remember, this is From Caracas. I am Ray Gomez. I have been talking with Maestro Juan Calzadilla, an outstanding representative of fine arts and literature here in Venezuela. Thank you very much.